All right, we're continuing tonight our lessons in Jerusalem, and in particular the times that Jerusalem is besieged and that it is destroyed. I want to read three passages of Scripture tonight to kind of set up the timeline or the time context that we'll be looking at. I want to read first of all from Luke chapter 21, verses 5 through 6. Jesus, or this is a conversation preceding the Mount Olivet Discourse. While some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, "As for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be torn down." And they questioned him, saying, "Teacher, when therefore will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" So we'll be talking about the temple in just a few moments, so keep that in the back of your mind. And then I want you to turn to Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 2 to start with. There are three things that I want to kind of plant in your minds tonight as we start. So this is the day of Pentecost, and they're preaching, and the people hearing it are saying this in verse 8. "And how is it that we each hear them in our own language to which we were born? Parthians and Medes, and Elamites, and the residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and the districts of Libya around Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them in our own tongues speaking of the mighty deeds of God." And then in chapter 12, verses 20 through 24, "He," that is Herod, "was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. And when with one accord they came to him, having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace, because their own country was fed by the king's country. And on an appointed day, Herod, having put on all his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And the people kept crying out, 'The voice of a God and not of a man.' And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him, because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied." So three thoughts that you have. First of all, on the grandeur of the temple and the fact that Jesus says the temple is going to be destroyed. Secondly, on the amount of or the number of people that are in Jerusalem at one time. And thirdly, on the person of Herod. Because when you go through the New Testament, the Gospels and the book of Acts, and you see the word Herod, who do you think of? Do you think of the one who killed the babies when Jesus was born? Do you think of the one who cut off John the Baptist's head? Do you think of the one who actually had Jesus appear before him during the night of his trial? Do you think about this Herod who speaks before these Jewish people and is stricken? Or do you think about Herod that is spoken of in Acts 26? So, is this the same man, or are there two men, or are there three men, or are there four men who are called Herod? So that's what we're going to be looking at as we think about this timeline tonight. We're going to think about Jerusalem from Herod to Florus. Two quotes by Martin Goodman, who wrote the book Rome and Jerusalem. He says, "It has been argued with some justification that the whole traumatic experience of opposing the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes was decisive in ensuring that over the following centuries, Jews, unlike some other Near Eastern peoples, retained their ancestral customs intact." So the argument is made that were it not for Antiochus Epiphanes, that the Jewish people might have eventually been absorbed into the Greco-culture, and that the culture of Jerusalem and the religion of Jerusalem and the Jewish people might have finally been watered down through the ensuing decades and even centuries. And this might be true. However, because of Antiochus Epiphanes and because that he stirs them up in the temple, and then you have the Maccabean revolt and the ensuing reign of the Hasmonean kings that we've talked about, the religion of the Jewish people and Jerusalem and Israel itself is actually revived. We talked about this past Sunday about suffering and why people suffer. Why does God bring suffering? And how is suffering used by God? Well, I think that the suffering of the people of Israel was used by God to keep them as a national and religious entity until the time of Jesus. Now, was it a perfect national and religious entity? No, it was not. Even in the intertestamental literature, books such as First Maccabees, and here's the second quote from Martin Goodman, he says, it narrates the political history of Judea from 175 to 134. It is a remarkable, blatant example of dynastic propaganda dressed up as piety. And so when you come to the time of Jesus and you see the Pharisees and especially the Sadducees, there's a lot of things that are called political in nature and that they go under pietistic garb and religious garb when in fact it's political. And so that is something important to think about when you read the New Testament. Now, if you were to be asked, under what ruler did Jerusalem reach its zenith of grandeur, including the temple itself, who would you say? Would you say King David? Or perhaps you'd say King Solomon. After all, we think about the wealth of Solomon and how that the Queen of Sheba says the half had not been told to her. But the answer is not David. The answer is not Solomon. The answer is Herod. Under Herod, Jerusalem reached the height of its grandeur. When Jesus is in the temple with the disciples, and they are saying, wow, look at this, what a great place this is. This was all built by Herod. Not Solomon, not Zerubbabel, Herod. Herod the Idumean, who could never have been a priest in this grand temple in which he built. The Jerusalem that is described in the Gospels and in Acts is far more splendid than the Jerusalem of 1 Samuel through 2 Chronicles, through the beginning of the monarchy until the end of the monarchy. The Jerusalem of the intertestamental period is hardly more than a backwater. We've seen this. It's a providence of the Persian and then the Greek Empire. But the Jerusalem under Herod the Great is a great city, perhaps number 2 in the Middle East at that time. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, that such a man as Herod would build such a city. Much like Rome of the time, it was built under the architectural inspiration of the city of Alexandria. So again, we see the Greek influence on both Roman and Jewish worlds. And yet, Jerusalem in all of its splendor, is the most magnificent that it would ever be, would last less than 100 years. And so in this lesson, we're going to take up the reign of Herod at its end. Actually, when I say the reign of Herod, I mean the reign of the house of Herod. And we're going to go up into the time of Florus. And we'll see the rise of the city and the seeds of its demise as we look next week at its fall. Now, something important. Both the Jews and the Romans have extensive literature from this period. Tacitus, other historians. And the ironic thing is that both Roman literature and Jewish literature was preserved by Christianity. That's a kind of an ironic twist. The most important writer of that time, of course, other than the writers of the Gospels and Paul himself, was a man by the name of Josephus, Flavius Josephus. He was born in 37 A.D., died in around 100 A.D. He was born as a member of Jerusalem's priestly class. He was in a very wealthy and prestigious family. Also, he's in a very good position to describe what's going to happen to the Jewish people. As the tensions with Rome grew, Josephus joined the party of the Zealots. He was a revolutionary. And for his interest and his participation in the revolution, he was given the generalship of the Galilean forces. Well, it proved out that he was not a very good general. His men were surrounded by the Romans as the war was in its early stages, and he contemplated suicide. But he said in the night he had a dream, and God told him not to commit suicide, but that he was going to be not a traitor to his people, but he was going to be used as a ministry to the people. He's going to write about not only the Jewish wars, but he's going to write about the history of the Jewish people. Well, he doesn't know that at the time, of course, but in 67 BC, he surrenders. He is taken to Rome. He's not forced to march in a triumph, but he is taken to Rome. But Vespasian takes a liking to him. And later on, when Vespasian becomes emperor, he gives the house that he was living in to Josephus. Josephus received a salary from the Roman government. He had housing. He had everything that you could take. He became a Roman citizen. And again, all of this at the behest of Vespasian. During the Jewish wars, when Vespasian's son Titus renews the wars, we'll talk about this next week as far as who leads the war against the Jews, but he has a front row seat. And indeed, in many cases, he tries to reason with the Jewish people because he always knew that the Romans were going to win. But they would not listen, and so he watches what happens to them as the Romans destroy them. He was always partial to his country, but he was also sympathetic and somewhat of an apologist to the empire that adopted him. His first works were called the Jewish Wars. This is when the Jewish Wars are fresh in his memory. It's the first major work that he does. And then he follows the Jewish Wars with a book called The Antiquities of the Jewish People. And I hope that you're familiar with both of them. They're both, it's maybe not something you want to sit down and read, like a systematic theology. Not many people want to sit down and read through systematic theology. But at the same time, it's something that is very good to have for references and maybe to read from time to time. It's very interesting reading. He writes very well, and he can be flowing, and sometimes he can exaggerate, sometimes he can contradict himself. But historians say, for the most part, he has proven to be very accurate. Antiquities is the book that we've referenced up until this point. Even though he writes it later, it covers the history of the Jewish people from their inauguration until the reign of Florus, which is why tonight's lesson is on from the Herodian family to the house of, or to the procuratorship of Florus. So, we want to begin with Herod rebuilds Jerusalem. We talked about last week how that Herod had once again conquered Jerusalem, how he had taken away from Aristobulus II, and Aristobulus is taken to Antioch, where he is executed by Mark Antony. Mark Antony and Herod are pals, okay? Unfortunately, Mark Antony and Octavian are not pals, and they are vying for power. They are at once colleagues and adversaries. And so Eventually, as you know, Octavian wins. Octavian becomes Herod, or he doesn't become Herod. He becomes Caesar Augustus, the great Caesar. The Julius Caesar perhaps is, the first of the emperors, but the Caesar who takes his name, and Julius Caesar was his uncle. He is the greatest of the Caesars. So Herod goes to, when Octavian defeats Antony, Herod had the good fortune and perhaps the good sense not to be in that battle. He goes to Augustus after the battle, and he swears that he will be as true to Augustus as he ever was to Antony. And Augustus believes him, and so Augustus leaves him as the king of the Jews. Augustus himself, around 27 BC, starts a very ambitious building program in Rome. He is rebuilding the city. Much of the grandeur that was Rome started under Augustus. Herod decided that he was going to copy his new friend, and he also begins to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, both men, you always say you want to do this for the city, and Rome is a political city. It's the center of the empire. Jerusalem is a religious city. It's the city of the Jerusalem religion from all the world. And so they both say that they're building for, the city and for the future, but both of them are really building for their own careers and for their own names and for their own place in history. Both selfish in that respect. So Herod begins this rebuilding process. He first rebuilds the walls of the city that he himself had torn down in the latest siege along with the Romans, and he builds the fortress of Antonia. Now remember, this is just before Antony dies, and so he names it after Antony, Mark Antony, and he never changes the name of it. Next, he builds his own palace, which featured huge buildings and ponds and parks throughout. You can see pictures of this, artist concepts online. He built a monumental amphitheater outside of the city. And then he built a new part of the city that we were talking about before. Forgot it again. Belteshazzar? Close enough. You can look it up online. But it was in the northwest part, and the word actually means the new town. So Jerusalem more than doubles in physical size, and the population is exploding as well. Now, to support all of this, when a population grows, what's something you got to do? You got to rebuild the infrastructure. You got to add to the infrastructure. We hear about infrastructure all the time, even in our own country. If you're going to have progress, you got to have infrastructure. Well, Rome had a river. Jerusalem only had a spring, the spring of Gihon. And it would not support the burgeoning population of Jerusalem. And so they were forced to begin to build a system of aqueducts to bring water into the city. Now, this would be controversial in time, and we'll see of that in just a few moments. But by far the most impressive project that Herod would ever undertake would be the rebuilding of the temple. So he made this big announcement. And the people in the city were very disturbed at first. They thought, well, he's going to tear down the second temple, and he'll start a temple, and then he won't have the money to finish it, and so we'll be stuck with an unfinished temple. But they need not ever have worried about that. The work went on even after Herod was dead. It was a work that in its totality took about 60 years, but most of it did come to fruition in his lifetime. But remember, when Jesus is in the temple grounds with the disciples, Herod has been dead for over 20 years. Herod the Great, the first Herod. So the work itself went on. In fact, when the work was finally stopped and finished, they say there was about 60,000 workers in Jerusalem that were unemployed. And Agrippa II had to put them to work on putting new stones on the roads to keep them from just having a huge homeless population in Jerusalem. And again, we don't know anything about homeless populations either, do we? Until you go to the big cities and you see it. So he rebuilds this temple, and the reconstructed temple, I read this to you last week, was a marvel. It was more than a tribute to Judaism. It was, again, a monument to Herod himself. It was his largest thing. It covered like 15 football fields. It was huge. They say that on the wall that goes down into the valley, they said a person could hardly look down that wall, down that cliff, and not be physically sick. It was so far. The stones that were used were like 25 feet across. One stone. And the stones that they used, during the intertestamental period, the stones were rough-hewn that they used. In the rebuilding of the temple and most of Jerusalem, the new projects, they said you could tell, and you still can do this in many places, you could tell the old part from the new part because the old part had the rough-hewn stones, and the new part, the stones were almost polished. They were so smooth. And to keep from disturbing the priests while they were going about their daily activities, Herod had most of the stones and as much as he could pre-assembled, pre-cut, so that when the workers brought them in and they kind of covered over the second temple, they wouldn't disturb the priest in their activities. So you can imagine the amount of money that must have cost the population of Jerusalem and the surrounding communities and taxes to build these huge buildings and projects. As far as I know, they didn't have a Fed that could just print money and they could just keep going on. I think it had to be actual money like silver and gold to accomplish these things. The temple affected every part of Jerusalem, of the life of Jerusalem. They say that about 25% of the population of Jerusalem worked directly or indirectly for the temple. They divided the priesthood up into 24 courses in order that they could have different teams at different times throughout the day making all the animal sacrifices. And throughout the day you would smell the smoke and the raw flesh of the animals that were being sacrificed. It was tremendous, hundreds of animals, and during the feast times thousands of animals were sacrificed. During the Passover, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, thousands came. At Pentecost, another one of the feasts, which we see in Acts chapter 2, which I read, you saw how many nationalities of people were there in Jerusalem at that time. So Jerusalem's population, though it was probably around 100,000, as many as 1 million people could be there at one time when they were having the festivals and the special religious days. During some of those days is when the Romans would fall upon them, even during the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. You know, Jesus tells the disciples in the Olivet Discourse, when you see these things coming, get out. Get out. But most did not heed the words of Jesus. And so the Romans caught them at a time when the city was filled with people from all over, Jewish people. Something else that I thought was very interesting, the population was very heterogeneous. The rich and the poor lived in the city as they do in every city, but they didn't live in sections. There wasn't the upscale section, and there wasn't the ghetto section. There wasn't the middle class section and the upper middle class section and the project section. They lived interspersed. There would be rich people who lived here, and then next door there might be poor people. And one of the examples of this was Queen Helena of Adiabene, which is a country in the north of Mesopotamia. Her entire country converted to Judaism, and she was so devoted to Judaism that she moved to Jerusalem. While she lived in Jerusalem, in fact she died in Jerusalem, she was known for her benevolence to the citizens. She was a very charitable woman. She was a very wealthy woman. She built her gravesite there. It consisted of 3 separate pyramids. One contemporary writer of that day said that there was, I can't remember the name of the first guy. I think it was like Massas. But he said of all the graves that he'd seen, not counting the grave of Octavian, which he built long before his death as well, and Herod also built a magnificent grave for himself. But this woman had the second most opulent grave in the world at that time. Can you imagine? She died and was buried there, and the Romans tore it all down, like the Romans will. Between 4 and 7 BC, Herod died. His death was very gruesome. He had inflammation. He had ulcers. Parts of his body rotted off. In his lifetime, he had murdered his wives. He murdered Mariam, and there was a Mariam the second. He murdered blood relatives. He murdered 2 of his sons. He murdered kings. He murdered citizens. Even when he died, just before he died, when people thought they'd heard word, Herod is dying, Herod's gone, and Herod had placed a large eagle representing the Roman Empire, and Augustus in particular, over the entrance to the temple. If you can imagine how that must have infuriated the Jews. And just before he died, 2 of the priests, one of them by the name of Eleazar, decided that they would incite these young rebels to scale the walls and chop that emblem down and destroy it. And they did. And Herod heard about it on his deathbed. He had those 2 young men and the 2 priests burned alive. And many of the others killed, but not quite as barbarically. That's the kind of guy he was. Even on his deathbed, he is a murderer. Well, he left a will, and it had changed several times. To begin with, his 2 sons by the first Mariam were to be his heirs, but he supposedly caught them in a conspiracy, and so he killed both of them. So any ties to the Hasmoneans was now forever gone. He had 3 sons, Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. And he left in his will that these 3 sons, that none of them would be the sole ruler, but that the kingdom would be divided among them, that Archelaus would have Samaria, Idumea, and Judea, that Antipas would have Galilee and the Decapolis, and that Philip would have the Golan, what's today the Golan Heights, but more to the north. They sent the will off. The 3 brothers went to Augustus to see if the will would be approved by him. And as soon as they were gone, the Jews began to break out into riots. And this is really where we're going tonight. This is the prelude to the Jewish wars. This is the prelude to the fall of Jerusalem. So while he is gone, Varus, the Roman governor in Syria, sent troops to quell the riots, and order was restored. But the people resented the fact that the legions marched in carrying their banners, and they would do this under Pilate as well. And so as soon as he had left, they installed Sabinus to be the temporary governor of the region, and he was somewhat underhanded and greedy, and under his rule, for various reasons, the Jews rioted again. And once again, Varus puts down the riots in bloody battles. Meanwhile, Augustus made Archelaus, he wouldn't let any of the sons be king. He honors the will, but he makes Archelaus tetrarch, and Antipas and Philip are ethnarchs. The real power in the area would now be under what is called Roman governors or Roman procurators. And the 5th procurator is a man by the name of Pontius Pilate. At times, Pilate could be gracious. On one occasion, he changed out the guard at the garrison from Caesarea. Most of the time, he was not in Jerusalem. He did not spend his time in Jerusalem. He spent his time in Caesarea Philippi. And why wouldn't he? Would you rather spend your days on the beach where it's pleasant and the people are pleasant, or would you rather be up in the hills with those rioting, arrogant Jewish leaders? No, he took Caesarea. But he had to keep a garrison there, and he would change his troops out in the garrison, which was right down from the temple at Antioch, in fact. And as they were doing this, they marched in with their standards, and the standards had, the emblems of Augustus, and the Israelites considered this to be idolatry, and so a riot breaks out, and Pilate has this put down, and he's going to execute the rioters and those who had fell on the troops. But a group of people came up to Caesarea, and they talked to him, and he decided to be gracious and let them go. On another occasion, Pilate raids the temple treasury. Yes, he could do that. He doesn't raid the articles of the temple, but he raids the money that's being put into the temple coffers, and he takes that money ostensibly to build more aqueducts, because they're always needing more water. They always need more utilities. And so he's going to build an aqueduct, and the people riot again because of this action, and this time Pilate falls on them. He sends his soldiers, and they kill thousands. Or is it, maybe in this instance it's the one where he killed 560 people. There was one where he kills thousands, one where he only killed 560 people. But the issue is, these riots would just go on intermittently, and these governors would put these riots down, and each time it would cost Roman lives and Jewish lives, and mostly Jewish lives. Now that'll change in 67 for a brief while, but then the Romans will come back with a vengeance. After the death of Caesar Augustus, Tiberius became emperor, and it was during this time that Pilate was in Israel. So Tiberius is the emperor when all that's happened to Jesus happens. And after him, Caligula becomes the emperor. And Caligula was a maniac to start with. And on top of that, he hated the Jewish people. He was considering putting a statue of himself in the temple. How do you think that would have went over? Not too good. But just as he was making his decision, he died. And so the very next year, Claudius became emperor, and Claudius reinstates a Herod to be king of the Jewish people. Now, they still have the Roman procurator there, but they change from the tetrarchy back to the title of king. And the first king is Agrippa the first, and so once more Herod's line is on the throne. So when you're reading the Bible and you're looking at the Herods, so the first Herod, Herod the Great, is the Herod that is there when Jesus is born, the one that we hear about in Matthew chapter 2. The Herod that you hear about in the Gospels, who is the Herod who puts John the Baptist to death, because of his questionable marriages, that is Herod Antipas. That is one of Herod's sons. He is the son who is the leader or the ethnarch of Galilee. He is the Herod who puts John the Baptist to death. He is the Herod that Jesus calls that fox. He is the Herod that sees Jesus at his trial, because he just happened to be in Jerusalem when Jesus was being tried. The Herod that you see in Acts in chapter 12 is Agrippa the first, the one that Claudius reinstates as king. He is the one who dies. We saw that tonight in chapter 12. And then his son, Agrippa the second, becomes king in his place. He is the Herod who hears the testimony of Paul in Acts 26. Antipas, going back to Antipas the first, he was eventually exiled because of just questionable things, and even his nephew Agrippa was against him. So he was a bad guy, but there were no good guys. But one thing about Agrippa I and Agrippa II, Herod had always wanted to please the Jews in some way. Now, he never slacked back from having to use force and violence to have them go along with him, because remember, if he didn't keep order, Caesar would. So one of the things that drove him, he's a bad guy, he doesn't need much help, but he never wanted Caesar breathing down his neck. But he built the second temple, and he was very interested in the Jewish faith. Remember, the Idumeans had been proselytized, essentially coerced to become Jews. The next Herods were also very interested in the religion. In fact, Agrippa I would not allow his daughter to marry, and they had all these arranged alliances, but he would not allow her to marry unless her husband agreed to be circumcised. And he refused. The marriage was canceled. The first one. And so when Festus says to Agrippa, he says, I know you know about these matters. He does know about those matters because he is steeped in the Jewish faith. But he's not a believer. And when the rubber meets the road, as we'll see next week, Agrippa II, who do you think he's going to stay with, the Jews or the Romans? The Romans. Josephus records a speech, and we'll allude to it next week, that he gives before the Jewish people, urging them not to rebel against the Romans. Which brings us to the conclusion tonight, and that is the final section, Prelude to Destruction. Again, to refer back to Rome and Jerusalem, Goodman asked the question, was the war between Rome and Jerusalem inevitable? Did it have to happen? Well, on one way you could say it, of course, Jesus says it's going to happen. There was no way it wasn't going to happen, right? There was no way that it wasn't going to happen, and there was no way that Jerusalem was going to survive. Because Jesus says to the disciples that day in the temple compound, he says, you look at these stones, men, you look at these really nice polished white rocks, 25 feet across, tons in weight. Gentlemen, these walls, one stone won't be left upon the other. In time, that cliff that you look over and it takes your breath away, it'll be filled with rocks, and you'll be able to climb down on the rocks. But the question is this: why could the Jews, as many did and would, accept the fact that they were under Rome and enjoy the fact that the Romans gave them a great deal of freedom and independence for their culture and for their religion? And the Romans, why did the Romans have this particular disdain for the Jews, which they didn't have for other cultures? When I find it quite remarkable, and it's been this way throughout history, it's not so much today, how that royal families can interact with each other. When you see Herod and Antony and Herod and Octavius, and you know how that Agrippa and his son, they both were educated in Rome. They weren't educated in Jerusalem. They were educated in Rome. And their friends were Romans. Their schoolmates were Romans. It's like, when you think about your college buddies, their college buddies were from the University of Rome, not the University of Jerusalem. And it just flavors things. So the Romans could be somewhat reluctant to use power because, after all, the Herods were on the throne, and they were friendly towards the Herods. But the Jewish people could never accept the Herods, and they could never accept the Romans. And so the war, even though it was hugely controversial, there's essentially a civil war before there's a Jewish war. But the war is going to happen, just as Jesus said it would. I leave you with this, and if you're watching online, you can get this from the church office. We'd be glad to get it. But we have what is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and essentially it's the reign from Julius Caesar through Nero. Nero is the last of what is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. It's what you might say the first installment of the Caesars. And many of these Caesars, of course, were reigning during the time of Jesus and the disciples, the apostles, and Paul, including especially Claudius and Nero during the time of Paul and Peter in their ministries. And then we have also the Herodian dynasty. And you could look at this online at home, and what would be interesting would be to see how many of these people Herod actually killed in his own family tree, beginning with his first wife, Miriam, who died in 29 B.C. Yeah, because he murdered her. And then you go all the way down, and you see the last one there is Agrippa II, who is the king, the Herodian king, when the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 A.D., which we will look at next week. All right. Questions or comments now? And you can ask along. Even though we're recording, you could stop me at any time, and I'd be glad to repeat the question for the audience online, and we can talk about it. I'm going to be honest with you. Just the intrigue of this to me is, again, how in God's plan all of these factors come together. So that when Jesus sits in there, was Jesus a politician? Did Jesus know the politics of... Because to foresee this, you would have had to be able to foresee the politics of Rome and the politics of Jerusalem. Did Jesus foresee that, humanly speaking? He didn't have to, because divinely he knew what was going to happen. His Father had ordained what was going to happen. Jerusalem is going to fall. They're going to fall for a reason. The temple is going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed for a reason. And it's all in the plan. And no matter how they tried to forestall the war, no matter how the moderates tried to, reason with the war hawks, there just was no turning back. There was no turning back. And essentially the wealthy lose to the poor, because the wealthy people didn't want war. Because they could see what Jesus told them. Again, think about this. Jesus not only foretold the war, he foretold this. When this happens, if you're smart, you'll get out of here. Don't stay and fight. Don't be martyrs for Jerusalem. Don't fight on the steps of the temple. Get out. Get out. I think that's very interesting, that Jesus doesn't say defend Jerusalem. Jesus doesn't say defend the temple. He says, leave it. Leave it. Okay.